This episode is brought to you by Netflix. So Netflix is basically Santa this year. 2 NFL games on Christmas Day, streaming live. At 1 p.m. Eastern, it's Cowboys, Commanders. Then at 4:30, you've got Lions, Vikings. Midwest football, playoff stakes, and probably some snow. Watching holiday football is a tradition the whole family can enjoy. Open some gifts, grab some food, settle in, and watch NFL Live on Netflix this Christmas Day.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Carvana makes car selling fast and easy from start to finish. Enter your license plate or VIN and get a real offer in seconds, down to the penny. If you accept, Carvana will come pick up your car from your driveway. Or you can drop it off at one of our car vending machines. Either way, you get paid instantly. It's fast, transparent, and 100% online. Car selling that saves your time. That's Carvana.
Carvana.
Pickup fees may apply.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute, and this episode is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus and HelloFresh. Today's episode features an exploration of the economic relationships between Native American peoples and British colonists in the Southeast during the early 18th century. And although our study will be specific, the Great Courses Plus can help you expand your exploration of Native American history with its course, Native Peoples of North America. It's a course the Great Courses Plus partnered with the Smithsonian to make, and it's a course led by award-winning professor Daniel M. Cobb. It's also a course that you can try for free with the free trial the Great Courses Plus will give you when you visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. In Native Peoples of North America, Professor Cobb recounts epic stories of resistance and accommodation and of persistence and adaptation from just before Christopher Columbus set foot on Hispaniola through the 20th century. There's even a 30-minute video called The Native South and Southwest in the 1600s that discusses the origins of the Native American peoples we'll discuss in this episode. The Great Courses Plus can also help you move beyond the subject of history. It has over 8,500 lectures in its vast library of courses that can help you satisfy your curiosity about so many different subjects, like math, science, psychology, and even about how to perform new skills such as cooking, photography, and speaking a new language. All of these fascinating lectures are presented by award-winning professors and experts in easy-to-watch 30-minute-long videos that you can stream, download, and watch all on your own schedule and on all your favorite mobile devices. So visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld to extend your exploration of history and to dive into new topics simply because they fascinate you. To claim your free trial of the Great Courses Plus, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 171 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. The past is what happened, history is created. It's created every time someone decides which events and people from our past to research, which historical sources to use and emphasize as important, and how they want to interpret those sources to discuss the events and people they selected. Given that history is a creation, it shouldn't be surprising to us that it's also filled with myths and creations that don't always line up with how the past actually happened. Sorting myths from facts, looking at the context of how and why past events happened as they did, and how and why past people acted as they did, is among the work historians do. And today, we're going to speak with a historian who wants us to see how Native Americans and British colonists really traded with each other during the early 18th century. She's trying to dispel the myth that Native Americans had only a simplistic and incomplete understanding of European trade practices, and only understood trade as a method of gift exchange. Jessica Stern is a professor of history at California State University, Fullerton, and the author of The Lives and Objects, Native Americans, British Colonists, and Cultures of Labor and Exchange in the Southeast. Jessica is going to take us on a journey into the Southeast during the early 18th century, so we can explore how Native Americans and British colonists really traded with each other and what they really understood the meanings and benefits of their trade to be. Now, during our journey, Jessica reveals information about Native American peoples in the Southeast during the early 18th century, the different types of trade Native Americans and British colonists conducted with each other, and how using anthropology and its techniques can help us better understand the past. But first, you should join the Ben Franklin's World listener newsletter. It's an email that puts the show notes for each new episode right in your inbox. Plus, every once in a while, the newsletter will bring you timely information about news and events of interest. And signing up for the newsletter will also get you access to our private listener community on Facebook. You'll receive the special link to join the group right after you sign up for the newsletter. All you have to do to sign up is text BFWorld to 33444 or visit benfranklinsworld.com. Okay, are you ready to explore how Native Americans and British colonists in the Southeast traded with each other? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a native of Northern California. She's a professor of history at California State University, Fullerton, with a strong interest in anthropology, which influenced her first book, The Lives and Objects: Native Americans, British Colonists, and the Cultures of Labor and Exchange in the Southeast. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jessica Urish-Stern.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be on the show.
And we're glad to have you on the show. Now, in The Lives and Objects, Jessica explores and unravels the economic and social relationships that took place between Southeastern Native American peoples and British colonists during the early 18th century, and how the culture of these various groups influenced those relationships. Jessica, before we start investigating those relationships in detail, would you tell us about the Southeastern Native American peoples you explore in your study? Who were they, where did they live, and did they share any common cultural practices given their shared region?
Yeah, certainly. So just to get us situated, my book is mainly set in what is current-day South Carolina and Georgia. These colonies were established pretty late in the British Atlantic colonial game. So, if Jamestown is the benchmark of the first sustained colony in 1607, South Carolina doesn't come around until the 1670s, and then Georgia in the 1730s. So one of the reasons I choose them is because they are established within this time period, in my mind, of a real economic, ideological formation in Britain. But the other reason I choose them is that they're established next to some very powerful Native American nations, many of which largely escaped the devastating epidemics, at least temporarily, that wiped out other populations in the earliest century. So the Southeast becomes this scene where early settlers were significantly outmatched by Native American polities who were there. And the Native American groups that largely feature in my book are also the ones that would probably be the most familiar to your listeners: the Cherokee and then the Muskogee, whom the English called the Creek Indians. By the middle of the 18th century, the Creeks and the Cherokees were the two groups that had the most sustained economic contact with the British settlers who established South Carolina and Georgia. But there are other groups who may not be common names to most Americans, and they're also significant to the region. And these are the Yamacraw, the Yuchi, and the Yamasee. In my book, I made kind of a risky decision, right, to lump all of these groups together under the term Southeastern Indian. This isn't a term that they would have used. And actually, in my historical training, the idea of not treating Indian nations as separate from each other was anathema, right? You never want to make the mistake that an Indian is always an Indian. You always want to pay particular attention to the differences between the groups. So it was hard for me to come to the conclusion to make this a regional story. But for me, the reason that I decided to do this and that I feel comfortable doing this is because a lot of these groups in the Southeast, excluding the Cherokee, I'll talk about them separately, but they're descendant from the Mississippian chiefdom. These were the groups that Hernando de Soto described as being so formidable during his entrada, which started in 1539. But, these are also the groups that de Soto described as not only being formidable, but also having these strong city centers, having these large mounds. And we also know that they had a very hierarchical society. But what happens is many of these collapse by 1730, and their descendants, they coalesce into new societies. And these new societies have a lot of the same cultural and ceremonial traditions. So, for instance, a lot of them celebrate the green corn ceremony. A lot of them tell the myth of the corn mother. A lot of them have the same hunting rituals. So I feel comfortable treating them as the Southeastern Indians, and also treating them as a whole lets me show the differences in reactions for these people. So one of the things I try to emphasize in my book is how both the Native American groups in the Southeast and the English settlers were undergoing significant cultural changes in the early 18th century. And because of these changes and these experimentations in culture, economy, and society that accompanied these changes, the possibility for cultural overlap was greater than it may have been at other times.
So mentally, we're placing ourselves in the geographic region of Georgia and South Carolina during the early 18th century and looking at the Cherokee and descendants of the Mississippian people. Now, what were relations like between these southeastern Native American peoples and the British colonists who settled in South Carolina and Georgia during the early 18th century?
When South Carolina is first founded in 1670, it's largely stocked by Barbadian planters, and the goal was to set up a plantation economy. But as we see in a lot of different colonies throughout the whole Atlantic world, clearing land, identifying appropriate crops, getting those crops to flourish, establishing commercial networks, that all takes time. So very quickly, the early settlers in South Carolina, they came to rely on trade with the Native American groups. And I just want to emphasize that not gift exchange. They're very clear from the beginning that they are trading goods for goods with these Southeastern Indians. And it's very informal. So I think I visually imagine it as, these Southeastern Indians, usually individuals, going into the settlements or, close to a farm and kind of trading one-on-one with individuals. We really think that the majority of these early settlers are doing some sort of informal trade. And this trade is largely peaceful in the beginning. But what happens is when there is conflict, and there is a lot of conflict in this region, largely because quickly there becomes an emerging slave trade. And we have a lot of groups that are being dispersed from other places. The Westo are the most famous example. And they're kind of flooding into this region. They're seizing captives. And there's kind of a knockoff effect of violence. So at these moments of violence, this trade that was once informal becomes much more concentrated, either in the hands of governmental officials, or as time goes on, a lot of wealthy individuals start to control the trade economically through corporations. So we see a movement from informal relationships to more formal, controlled relationships.
You've mentioned several terms now that I really think we should unpack a bit so that we can better understand those terms and what we're really talking about here. Would you start by telling us why one interaction might be classified as a formal trade, while another interaction might be classified as an informal trade?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm calling an informal trade would be an episode that might just happen once. Like maybe you happen upon an individual, you settle the terms of the transaction. How many beads am I going to give you for this amount of food? And there's no routine to it. What I'm calling a more formal trade would be the instances where this trade relationship becomes more regular between specific parties and rules get more regimented. So it's agreed that a deerskin is always going to be traded against X number of axes, for instance. So that is the distinction I'm making.
And what types of goods did Southeastern Native American peoples and British American colonists trade with each other in the early 18th century?
So that period of time where I'm talking about this really informal trade, since the settlers really needed the tools of survival, they're getting a lot of food and things to keep them warm, right? So this is where deer skins come into play. First, they come into play really as a mechanism of immediate clothing. Moving against those things, pretty early on, we see more prestige items, things that are going to move into Native American society that are more ornamental, beads, for instance, some clothing, if it has a particular look, even used clothing is traded back and forth. And as time goes on a little longer, guns become very prominent. So I track this one powerful individual by the last name of Woodward. And what I'm able to see by watching his trading patterns is when he's just trading from his own home, he's used to trading more beads and textiles. But when he goes out on his first trading mission, he quickly learns that he needs to start stocking his supplies with guns and ammunition, because guns and ammunition quickly start matching textiles and more ornamental items in terms of what the Southeastern Indians want and desire. Beads and textiles never go away, but they're matched by guns and ammunition.
Now, two other terms that you've mentioned and that you use in your book to discuss interactions between Native Americans and British colonists in the Southeast, are commodity exchange and gift exchange. What are these forms of trade, and why is the difference between them important?
Yeah, so this was my major goal. The impetus in me writing this book was me being kind of a closet anthropologist. I think largely because of taking GE classes as an undergraduate, I got really turned on to anthropology, but I've always been very shy, so I knew I was never going to be the type of person that would be able to do field work. But every chance I got, I would take an anthro class or I'd read anthro. And the first field of study that I took when I was at Hopkins was with Jane Geyer, this economic anthropologist. And as I read about all this interesting, fascinating stuff that anthropologists were doing to distinguish and find the overlaps between gift giving and commodity trade, I started reading historical accounts of gift and commodity trade. And I found that historians just weren't being as nuanced in how they viewed these terms. And I think that that's largely because it seems like it would be easy to tell the difference between gift giving and commodity trade, right? Primarily because it's so easy to tell in our own lives. You know when you've gotten a gift. It's something that you didn't necessarily ask for, you didn't necessarily choose. And that's very easy to tell between when you go to a store and you actually buy something. But in reality, particularly in contact zones, the differences between trading and gifting are often fluid and less clear. And I think one of the things that made this so unclear in the early modern period is that there was such a shortage of cash that a lot of commodity exchanges were executed using credit, right? So there wasn't an immediate transfer of goods and money. There was often what we call delayed reciprocity. So if we can't tell easily, right, what rules are we going to apply to tell these two terms apart? And anthropologists have convincingly shown that to accurately distinguish gifts and commodities, you have to look at their entire life, because many times gifts are produced and used differently than commodities. And this was one of the major failings I found with North American historians. They designate an item a gift or a commodity by looking at a freeze frame of the moment that an item changed hands, right? And if it's immediately reciprocated, it's called a commodity. And if it's not, it's a gift. But oftentimes the routes that gifts travel are different than the life trajectories of most commodities. So gifts, for instance, the term that's used are often terminable, meaning that they make one trip from giver to receiver, and then they stay with the receiver forever. But commodities can pass from hand to hand to hand. Gifts are often valuable because they're marked with a specific relationship and an identity, and that's one of the reasons that their value isn't standardized. But commodities have a widespread standardized value, and thus can move more easily between people.
You know, many scholars, when they study interactions between Native American peoples and North American colonists, they explore diplomacy. And yet, you've chosen to investigate their interactions through trade. When you study commodity exchange, gift exchange, and all the informal and formal trades that took place between Southeastern Native American peoples and British American colonists, what do you see that scholars who focus on diplomacy miss or don't see as clearly?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's actually a really good point. And I think that's largely what's happened in the Southeast is the major body of sources where we can see items trading hands are in diplomatic sources. In South Carolina, it's really frustrating because a lot of the governmental records will mention, we asked this trader to send back his account book. We received this account book from, this other trader. But all these account books are missing. So the picture that we have, and I think the reason that we often think that commodity exchange is lacking and gift exchange prevails, is just because of the body of sources that we have in this area. But, I did a lot of searching and I didn't find as many account books as I wanted. But when you do shift the focus and when you do look at the commodity trade, what you see is, first and foremost, Native Americans know how to trade goods without sentimental value, right? So there's this line that drives me crazy that pops up in history books that Native Americans always looked at trade as between friends. No, they didn't. They were completely comfortable just meeting somebody in the woods that they would never see before and exchanging an item. And you don't see that if you just look in the diplomatic realm. So what you see when you shift your gaze is you see a much more flexible economic system. You actually see a system on the ground that is more quickly marching towards kind of these liberal ideas of free trade, then if you look at the governmental level, you see a real resistance to allow commoners to trade with ease. And I think you also see a lot of Native American agency. You see them rejecting goods. I've seen many a trade factory sending back reports about how they can't sell hose at a particular time of year, or they can't sell beads that are a certain color. So you see a lot of Native American agency saying, no, we don't want to buy these things. We want to buy these other things, shaping their own material life.
You mentioned earlier that if we add anthropological techniques to our study of the history of trade as it took place between Native American peoples and British colonists in the Southeast during the early 18th century, that we can better understand the economic relationships between these groups. And that in order to better understand these relationships, we really need to understand the entire life of an object or good. To this end, you titled your book, The Lives and Objects. Would you tell us more about the lives objects contain and how we can use this anthropological technique to better understand the trade relationships we're exploring?
I'm a pretty unsentimental person who is very oblivious to my surroundings. So the claims that objects have lives make zero emotional sense to me. And so it might not for your listeners as well. But then again, maybe for some of your listeners, this is second knowledge. My husband is the complete opposite of me. So, we inherited from his family some beautiful mid-century modern furniture. And if anything comes close to damaging them, he reacts as if people are being injured. So this is one way to think about objects having lives. Certain objects can embody a history of a set of relationships. So for my husband, this furniture, it really embodies his childhood home, all the happy memories with his family. And we see a lot of these types of gifts in the Southeast. These are the types that hold a memory of past relationships. And, as I'm happy to talk about at length, it's really the Southeastern Indians who they're more likely to hold on to these types of goods. And in future treaty meetings, they'll be able to pull out these items. Usually there'll be like a medal or a string of beads, and they show these items and they say something like, in the past, at a previous treaty meeting, you gave us these items, and these items represent the relationship we've had for a long time. So that's one way that objects have lives. But objects can also spur people into action. They can make them think differently about themselves. So, for instance, when I was starting this research almost a decade ago, I was reading the New York Times, and there was an article by this character actress, Jackie Hoffman. And she described how her mother usually buys her gifts of clothing that are 5 sizes too big, and she goes back to the mall and she returns them. But 15 years ago, her mother gave her this 18-inch doll, and it was accompanied by a note that read, "Now we both have a beautiful little girl who wears glasses. You'll always be my little girl." And the fact that this gift captured a specific relationship ensured, and this is Hoffman's words, that she would never be able to give this gift away. She stuffs it in a closet. She tries to not look at it, but it's always there because it really is an image that her mother is creating of her and her relationship. And I see a lot of these types of gifts in the Southeast as well. For instance, Tomo Chichi, who's a Yamakaw leader, he often gave gifts to Georgia officials, and he would say, "I'm giving you this feather because you are soft and you are strong like an eagle. And I'm giving you this feather because I want you to always remember to use this strength to protect us and not to hurt us." So this is a way that gifts can not only embody a relationship, but attempt to manipulate that relationship to have somebody act a certain way. And I think maybe a final important way that lives can be captured by objects is that sometimes objects can really represent the energy of a community, the creativity, the technological labor of a society. And really both Southeastern and British individuals would point to objects their communities created as proof of their society's worth, right? So when a Southeastern Indian leader put down a stack of skins, 200 skins, it was him saying, "I was able to control the labor of my community to produce this hefty load of skins." And the English also did this as well. So there's this famous trip in 1734 where one of Georgia's founders, James Oglethorpe, he takes Tomo Chichi, who I just mentioned, to England. And before he takes him to the royal palaces, before he takes him to London to show him the urban streets, before he takes him to show him all of these marvels, the first place he stops is this textile factory in his hometown of Godalming. And he takes him to this factory. At this point, factories were pretty, this isn't a huge sprawling factory. It's still pretty early in industrialization. But he was so eager to show Tomochichi that the English were able to amass, to put all of these people in a room to create textiles and to get those textiles across the Atlantic, that he wanted Tomochichi to see this. And Oglethorpe, without fail, like every year, would send Tomochichi a parcel of these kerseys that were made in this factory to say, look, this is the labor that we are able to command. So this is yet another way that they're able to use objects to make a claim about the lives that they are able to control.
Those are really interesting stories, and I wonder if we could talk more about the production of goods and the labor involved in producing certain goods. Because it really seems to me like culture and the labor involved to produce certain goods must have really informed the meaning of those goods and whether or not someone would be sentimental about them. So, would you tell us how Southeastern Native Americans understood labor and goods production, and how their understanding informed their view of goods and their value?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, one of the things I steal from anthropologists is this idea of the life of the good, that you have to look at all phases. So I start my book by talking about production. And I do want to start by saying that the Southeastern Indians definitely had a sense of private ownership. Towns had both common fields where the produce belonged to the public, but also attached to each home, there was a private garden that contained the family's produce. And the same went with hunting. So John Locke has this line in the second treatise that reason makes the deer he who hath killed it. He actually ties this to the Indians. He says that the Indians would agree with this. And in practice, no doubt, the Southeastern Indians agreed. In fact, as the deerskin trade came to dominate more and more of the Southeastern Indian towns' labor, towns became much less communal. Hunting parties, they became much smaller, and this was because when there was a larger deer population, the whole town would go out to, light fires to surround this entire deer population. But as the deer population dwindles, hunting parties become much smaller. They usually contain just the nuclear family, and it's agreed that it is the person who actually kills the deer and the woman who dresses it who gets the proceeds of the deer. This becomes more and more common, and actually households in the Southeast, they start dispersing further and further away from the town square, and people go hunting regularly with just their nuclear family, as I said before. And as people are devoting more and more to the deerskin trade, what used to be a seasonal practice, it becomes almost year-round. So Southeastern communities are becoming more individualized. But what's surprising is that even though their daily life is actually becoming more invested in individualized labor, they create, and I am going to use the word create here because, again, as I said before, these are coalescing communities that are making decisions about what myths they're going to retell, which ceremonies they're going to retell. So I am going to use the word create. They create myths, they perpetuate myths and ceremonies that decide that they're going to emphasize communal labor instead of individual labor. So, for instance, one of the major ceremonies I investigate is this annual harvest ceremony called the green corn ceremony. Some people call it the busk. And what I found is there are these complicated transactions during the green corn ceremony where the food that is consumed, it goes through all these different hands. It has to stop at the edge of the square and then be picked up by somebody else, so that nobody knows who's producing this food. And I see that as an emphasis of downplaying individual labor and saying that we as a community are the ones producing. And I see this ethos several times during this ceremony. And I also see this in a lot of the myths. A lot of the myths that I read that are being recorded during the 18th century, they're really castigating people who choose to promote their own individual labor instead of working with the community. Whereas the Southeastern Indians are embracing in their day-to-day life this individualized labor, they're creating, I would almost call it, like protest practices. They're basically saying, we are not going to let the Atlantic trade decide how we're going to structure our society. Because another interesting facet of the green corn ceremony is everybody purges, everybody throws up, and then everybody paints themselves white. And then it is the town leaders, the religious leaders, who reestablish the hierarchy. And I see this as a moment where every year they're erasing any sort of status markers that might be tied to the Atlantic trade, and they're reinforcing the community order that grows out of their own norms.
And how did the Southeastern Native American view of production compare and contrast with how British American colonists understood labor and goods production?
Yeah, so I don't think the settlers who would have heard about the Southeastern Indian ideologies would have seen it as that foreign, because we also have a strand in Britain at this time that is really emphasizing common labor as well. You know, it's slowly starting to change, but in Britain, it is expected that people who are growing agricultural products, they don't make an individual profit, but if need be, if there's a time of famine, that they're expected to sell their produce either at a loss or to break even to make sure the community is fed. You know, I went through old newspapers during this time to see what the South Carolina inhabitants were reading. And one of the major pamphlets that is for sale over and over and over again is this pamphlet by Joseph Morgan called The Nature of Riches, which was published in Philadelphia in 1732. And he explicitly says that people should work communally. And the only reason that there's individual gain is because of man's sinfulness. There's commonality there. But whereas Southeastern Indians decide to double down on this community ethos, what I see in South Carolina and Georgia is the adoption of an ethos of a mythology that says that it is individualized labor, that instead of being sinful, as Joseph Morgan said, that actually if you work hard as an individual, you are going to help the common good. So I haven't talked explicitly about Georgia, but I think we see this in Georgia's founding mission. Georgia is just, I think it's one of the most fascinating colonies, right? So it is established as a buffer colony to protect South Carolina from potentially hostile Native Americans after the Yamasee War. But it's also created with this kind of idealistic vision that if you take the poor from Britain, if you give them a plot of land, if you give them the chance to be self-subsistent, they will become virtuous citizens. And there's really this view that individual labor can be very ennobling, that it can be transformative. One of the other sources that I read was a lot of sermons they're called anniversary sermons. They're written on the anniversary of Georgia's founding. And one of the major arguments that I see coming out of those sermons is this belief that the creator, and here they're talking about God, the creator always has control over his product, in this case, man. And so I think that their myth is one in which the individual labor is really leading to an individualized ownership. And I see them using the same language when they talk about the American Indians. They're really primed to believe that they, the British, give the American Indians these new technologies and they remake their world. And because they remake their world with guns and with new textiles, that just like man owes the maker allegiance, the Native Americans owe the settlers and the British Empire their allegiance. So even though there's overlap, we see each group choosing a different ideology to put front and center.
How did these contrasting views of goods production impact trade? What did it really mean for the trade that Native Americans in the Southeast were really doubling down on the idea that communal labor was the way to go to produce goods, while British colonists focused their ethos on individual efforts to produce goods?
You would think it might do more than it actually does. I see on the ground, and I think that maybe this is a difference between the elite and the commoners, but you see on the ground everyday Native Americans and everyday settlers able to transact goods very easily. And I think this might be because oftentimes myths and ceremonies, they're being perpetuated by the elite segments of society. So in this case, most of the trade is acting unbeknownst. to these competing ideologies. Where you see this as being really significant is once we get up to the diplomatic realm. What you see is the English attempting to use this language of individual ownership and, the right of the producer to control people who are consuming. You see them using this over and over in their language with the Native Americans. So there's this very telling speech that's given by Tobias Fitch, and he is a diplomat that's sent out by the Georgia government in 1725 to go and try to create more peaceful relationships with Upper Creek. And this is how he recorded it in his journal. This is what he tells this group of young warriors who were not alive during contact, and he's trying to instruct them about all the benefits that the English gave them. He said, "Before we came among you, there were no other weapons than bows or arrows to hunt with. You would hunt a whole day and bring nothing home at night. Therefore," he says, "how dare you, quote, set no greater value on us that have been such good friends to you than you do your enemy." So the argument quickly becomes one of colonization, that we have produced your material world and you owe us allegiance. And the flip side is also true, possibly because they see the power of goods. They really disregard Native American gifts in a way that I find almost tragic. So we have on one side Southeastern Indian groups that are keeping these gifts that have such sentimental value. But there are explicit rules about what to do with a Southeastern Indian gift. If a Southeastern Indian gift is received by a governmental official, he is required to turn it over to the public treasury. At that point, the public treasury could display it, they could announce it in newspapers, but no, instead of that, they're instructed to sell it immediately. I actually have account books that show this. They're supposed to calculate what half of the value is. Then they're supposed to pick a gift that would be the return gift so they can send it back to the Indians. And I think that this is really tragic because you have this system in which all this creativity, all this messaging that goes into gifts is systematically destroyed. And I end one of my chapters with this thought piece where I think about what if this had been different, right? So what if instead of selling all these Native American gifts, they had been prominently destroyed so that settlers who were walking into Savannah or Charleston, what if they saw the stack of 200 skins? Or what if they saw the gloves that had been intricately sewn to keep the governor's hand warm? Or what if they saw the painted skins? I really believe that if there had been a process of public display of these items, it might have led to more respect of Native Americans, and it might have led to an ethos where it wasn't okay for settlers to just take Native American land. But I trace all of these decisions back to this English model that items that are produced by individuals, they're very powerful because they show the productive power of individuals.
Tobias Fitch made a bold claim. He stated that British Americans believed that they had remade Southeastern Native Americans' worlds by trading them their goods. And after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, I'd love for us to discuss the goods that British Americans traded with Southeastern Native Americans and whether Fitch's observation or boast had any accuracy to it. Today's exploration has revealed that many Native American peoples in the Southeast developed a commercial trade in deerskins with British traders and colonists. Of course, Native Americans also relied on deer and other wild animals to feed their families, which is why some scholars assert that commercial hunting did not really interfere with Native American people's well-established rhythm of subsistence. Now, this rhythm of subsistence involved using the seasons to grow and acquire the freshest ingredients for their meals. Spring and summer were reserved for planting and the harvest, which the whole community participated with, while fall and winter saw hunters go off in search of wild animals, specifically the white-tailed deer, because the colder temperatures meant thicker fur coats and better meat for Native American families. Of course, in the 21st century, we have an abundance of fresh fruit available all year round, and with so many choices, it can often be difficult to choose which ingredients to buy and what meals to make for our families. This is where HelloFresh can really help us out. As a happy customer who has used HelloFresh for about 2 years, I know that HelloFresh sources the freshest ingredients all year round. Each week, they provide me with a wide variety of chef-curated recipes for meals like chicken cheddar fajitas, veggie-loaded orzo and sausage, and sliced steak tagliata, all of which I can cook in about 30 minutes. And because HelloFresh packages each meal in a handy pre-made meal kit, there's no food wastage. I have exactly as much food as I need to cook each meal. Plus, HelloFresh sends me all the food I need each week in a well-insulated, fully recyclable kit, which they deliver right to my front door, all for less than $10 a meal. You should give HelloFresh a try and see how much more fun and easy they'll make your meal times. For $30 off your first week of HelloFresh, visit HelloFresh.com and use promo code BFWorld30. Jessica, would you tell us about the goods British Americans traded Southeastern Native Americans, and whether Tobias Fitch's observation or boast had any accuracy to it?
Absolutely. I think that probably the most obvious example that comes to mind of your listeners, and this is completely fair, is what effect did guns and ammunition have on Southeastern Indian society? And there's been a lot of historical back and forth about this question. Some historians point out that guns in the 18th century were nothing like guns today, that they were actually pretty inefficient. And so you do have historians who puzzle over the Native American desire for guns because they point out that oftentimes it would be much more efficient with the existing skill set for Native Americans to just use traditional technologies. But I think that after reading the sources, I have to say that I side with the people who see guns as having a very significant effect on these Native American communities. And I think that this case is really made persuasively in a new book that's come out recently called Thundersticks by David Silverman. Because what he shows is that there was what he calls a gun frontier in which groups that had guns could, when they were displaced, use these guns to take over further land, and that there's a ripple effect of destruction and conflict. And at the source of this is really this guns and ammunition. But that's really the exception that I see. One of the questions that I ask in my final chapter is about whether other items besides guns, were they brought into Native communities as foreign objects that were always going to represent these relationships with the English? Or were they, domesticated? Were they remade? And I find that with textiles, they were significantly refashioned. Southeastern Indians had no interest at all in ready-made clothing that was already shaped into dresses or jackets. I always laugh when I would read a diplomatic encounter and a well-meaning governor would give a Native American a pair of shoes, because I have not found a mention of a purchase of shoes. They had no interest in actually buying shoes. So what I found is one of the most surprising findings when I did go through the account books that I was able to get a hold of is that they're investing a lot of their deer skins in haberdashery, which is, ribbons and tassels and thread and needles. And what this represents to me is how dedicated they were to remaking this clothing. And what you see, it's always funny to me when I'm reading travelers' accounts and travelers are trying to describe Southeastern Indian clothing and they just can't do it. Like they get tangled, they trip over themselves as they're trying to find equivalents to the things that Southeastern Indians have done with these textiles that they have purchased. So I find that there's a lot of significant reworking by Southeastern Indians of the items they take into their communities. On the other side of the Atlantic, the deer skins and the other items that make it across the Atlantic are largely domesticated as well. Deer skins, they join skins from a lot of other nations. They join domestic cow skins to be produced into leather goods. And somebody in Britain who is on a saddle or is wearing boots would have no idea whether this was a deer skin that originated in Creek country or whether this was a cow skin that, came from the interior of Britain.
So we know that both Native Americans and British American colonists in the Southeast during the early 18th century both had different ideas about goods and how they should be used, treated, and traded. We also know that both groups were trading for goods that they wanted to alter and adapt to their own uses. How did these views of goods inform how both groups traded for goods? I mean, there must have been rules or ideas about how to conduct trade.
Yeah, there are a lot of rules of trade. And I think that this is another thing that makes commodity trade so similar to gift exchange. Like there is a ritualization that we sometimes forget about. And this wasn't just for cross-cultural trade. Even within England or even within the colonies, there were a lot of questions about what were common practices. So, for instance, as I said before, a lot of transactions occurred with taking out debt and extending credit. But even though this was a common practice, when I went through the literature, when I went through letters coming out of South Carolina and Georgia, everybody knew that you had to repay the debt in a certain period of time. But there was a lot of confusion about how many months was allowed to elapse. Did you have to repay it after 3 months? Did you have to repay it after 12 months? So that's an example of a ritual, a rule that was constantly negotiated. What happens with the trade with the Native Americans is I see this very early period where there are very few rules that are dictating the trade. And when I say very few rules, very few governmental imposed laws. And I think this is because South Carolina is growing up at this moment of Whig ascendancy. And it's this moment in England where public monopolies, and by that I mean public monopolies would be when the government said to a corporation that only that corporation is allowed to transact, trade, and purchase things in a particular area. So for a while, monopolies, they were accepted. The idea was that international trade could become very unstable, and therefore it made sense to have one powerful company in control that was overseen by the executive. But what happens when we get to the late 17th century is there are a couple of significant court cases in England, and they revolve around the Royal African Company. So this is about the company trade in Africa, where the ability of the Royal African trade to keep foreigners from trading is greatly diminished. So this is seen as a turn against monopolies and an embrace of free trade. So South Carolina is created during this moment where they're like, yeah, the more people trading, the better. That's cool. And for a while, that prevails. So what South Carolina does is they create a judiciary body. If traders and Native Americans have disputes, they can come before this judiciary body. And usually what this judiciary body would do is they would just try to make everybody happy. So for instance, if there was a dispute about a canoe, let's say a Yuchi Indian had, in the minds of a white settler, agreed to sell his canoe for 40 skins. And there was a dispute because the settler who said that he purchased it took the canoe, but then the Yuchi Indians said, actually, it was supposed to be 60, 40 was just the down payment. So there's this big dispute. Usually the solution of this judiciary board was just pay back the 40 skins, give the person back their canoe, everybody's happy. Let's not try to create too many rules here. But then what happens is at points of warfare, so the biggest example is going to be the Yamasee War that starts in 1715. The government thinks they made a mistake. The government thinks, oh, wow, we cannot trust traders to figure out their own rules. And they snap back to this Tory mentality that the government really has to create strong rules to govern the trade. And, they really try to impose a lot of uniformity on the traders.
Okay, so by looking at all the rules of trade, by looking at specific interactions between Native American peoples and British American colonists in the Southeast, we really achieve a better understanding of the relationships between these two groups of people. But Jessica, how does this improved understanding of colonial Native American interactions in the Southeast help us better understand early American history as a whole?
Yeah, I think that one thing that it does is that once we step away from this narrative that has long been argued that the reason that there were trade regulations, and these trade regulations are pretty extensive, right? The trade regulations are traders can only trade in these certain towns. You can't take out any debt. You have to trade by these prices, right? So they're very extensive regulations. But the old narrative was the reason we had these regulations is because Native Americans didn't understand commodity trade. They're the ones that are pushing trade to look more like gift exchange. So once we take away that story, I think it opens up a more robust conception of the economic history of early America. How much was it free trade? How much was there an idea of trade regulations were normal and necessary? So I think it allows a more honest recognition of an economic history in early America that's not tied to Native American discomfort of commodities. I think it also, and honestly, like I will count myself successful with this book if I never see the line Native Americans only understood gift exchange in another book again, because I think that that's a really detrimental misconception of Native Americans. And I think it's one that percolates out to common society, out to popular culture. So when I was doing this research very early on, I remember watching, I think it was like in 2006, this Daily Show episode with Jon Stewart. That's how long ago it was. And he was covering the Seminoles' purchase of the Hard Rock chain. And he got a lot of mileage on this image of the Native Americans as economically stupid, right? So, oh, the Seminoles are so dumb. How would they be conned into this idea that a business based on gimmicks, is actually a viable business? He traced it all the way back to this story that Manhattan was purchased for 14 strings of beads. He used it as a chance to make fun of Native American clothing. And he ends by saying, until the Native Americans figure this money thing out, they're not going to be able to take America back. And I think that that's a really dangerous rhetoric to have, right? That's a story about colonization that blames silly Native Americans for what happened. If they had had a stronger, more nuanced, more sophisticated economic culture, they wouldn't have gotten what they deserved. So I hope that my book is also working to defeat that popular culture view of the Native Americans.
That popular culture view being that Native Americans didn't have complicated, sophisticated economic cultures when, in fact, they did have them.
Yeah, that they understood commodity exchange. Yes.
Okay, it's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if British settlers in the Southeast had been able to found their colonial economies on landed property as they originally intended, instead of on trade with Southeastern Native Americans for slaves and deerskins as actually occurred? How would the development of Southeastern societies have been different?
Wow, that's a real mind bender. That's a really good one. Okay, so the situation is South Carolina, they get their plantations in record speed. They don't have to have this robust deerskin trade. I think the biggest question on my mind is what would have happened to these lower class whites? I opened my database and I have a list of 400, and these are just the ones I can count, white Indian traders who went into the Southeast frontier to trade. So first question is, what would have happened to this class? And I imagine that something similar would have happened to them as happened in Virginia, right? So instead of participating in the deerskin trade, they probably would have been pushed onto the frontiers, hoping that they could start smaller plantations. My fear is that this would have put them in more conflict with Southeastern Indians because, the Indian traders, they moved into Southeastern communities, they married Southeastern Indians, they created mixed race families. But if they had just created plots of land, I think that the conflict would have been really significant there. I don't want to give the impression that the deerskin trade was conflict-free. There's this really detrimental war called the Yamasee War in 1715 that almost wipes out all of South Carolina. But I think that the conflict that would have been caused by these white settlers on the frontier would have been different. I think it would have been more localized. So it's very possible, as happened in Virginia, that when there was conflict with these frontier settlers, the government might have sided with the Indians and might have blamed the settlers for causing this conflict. So this might have caused more class conflict within South Carolina. There wouldn't have been a Yamasee War, that catastrophic war that I just mentioned, because that was a war, I think, that grew out of trade. And maybe most significantly, I don't think Georgia would have been established because Georgia, even though it was kind of like this idealistic brainchild by a lot of people who wanted this place for the poor whites to go, it really isn't until the Yamasee War makes people in Britain think that you do need a buffer state that Georgia gets the legs to run with. So it's very possible that Georgia wouldn't have been established. So if we turn our gaze to the Southeastern Indians and what their life would have been if there wasn't this deerskin trade that took over most of their economy, I think the deerskin population would have remained stable. I think there's actually a lot of argument that their lives would have been much stabler, that they could have stayed insulated from the Atlantic trade. Not completely. I think that even in regions where there wasn't as vibrant a deerskin trade, there definitely was exchange between the two groups, but it wouldn't have taken over their lives. So that would be an argument that would have led to more stability. But if I keep tracing this forward to the 19th century, I'm struck by how this might have changed the debate about Cherokee removal, because a lot of the individuals within Cherokee country who lead the charge against removal, the ones who do all the letter campaigns to the House of Representatives, the ones who create these kind of test cases that make it all the way up to the Supreme Court, a lot of those leaders were mixed race. And if there wasn't this infusion of Southeastern Indians marrying traders, there wouldn't have been this large mixed race population that attempts to head off the governmental removal. So geez, I don't know, it might not have been quite a fight. So there are arguments that it would have led to stability, but I think it would have really changed the fight against removal that we saw in the 1830s.
Wow, lots of contingency there. Nothing was inevitable.
Yeah, definitely.
So in what new ways are you mixing anthropology and history in your new project, Jessica?
So I am moving so far afield, which I'm not sure is a good idea right now. So in 2011, I wrote this article that argued that Roger Williams, who was the founder of Rhode Island, he is a 17th century Puritan. So that gives you the idea of how far afield I am. But I mean, it's related to the Native American stuff because what I argue is that his actions as a mediator during the Pequot War, which is another big Indian war in 1636, they really shape how he viewed religious toleration. So I believe that his kind of views about anthropology are going to affect his ideas about religious toleration. I'm now thinking of writing an entire intellectual biography about Roger Williams and showing all the different things that influenced him. We now know that he was reading medical textbooks, he was reading world histories. So I might write a biography of him. But I have to tell you, as I've gotten deeper and deeper into the Roger Williams work, I really, really, really miss the Native American work. So it's possible the Roger Williams piece will just be an article or two, and I'll come back to doing Native American history.
And if we still have questions about all the different topics we talked about today, how can we contact you?
I have a faculty webpage that you can find by just Googling my name. It should be one of the first things that pops up, and all of my contact information is on that site.
Jessica Stern, thank you for taking us through the trade and interactions that took place between Native American peoples and British colonists in the Southeast during the early 18th century.
Oh, geez, thank you. It has been a pleasure.
By exploring interactions between Native American peoples and British colonists in the Southeast, we can see that even in the early 18th century, Native Americans understood the colonial American economy to be complex and multifaceted. We can also see that they were active and well-informed participants in that economy. As Jessica revealed, Native Americans didn't just trade with people they knew, and they didn't just give gifts to one another. In fact, they understood trade similar to the ways that Europeans and colonists understood trade. As an exchange of objects and goods someone else wanted for a defined price that they received in credit, currency, or in another desired commodity. Now, this isn't to say that Native American people and British colonists didn't also exchange gifts. They did. They understood gifts as being objects that symbolized or embodied a specific relationship. They were something you gave to another person to remind them of your relationship. Of course, when it came to diplomatic gift-giving, Native Americans in the Southeast often proved more sentimental than their British counterparts. As Jessica noted, Native Americans often brought the gifts Britons had given them to diplomatic meetings and negotiations to remind the British that they knew the history of their relationship. Meanwhile, the British proved less sentimental. They often took the gifts Native Americans gave them right to the public treasury, where they estimated their value, divided it in half, and then sold the gift. As Jessica wondered out loud, what would relationships between the British and Native Americans have looked like if the British had held on to these gifts and viewed them in a greater, more sentimental regard? By taking the time to investigate how trade between Native Americans and British colonists in the Southeast took place during the early 18th century, we can see how the early American economy operated in greater detail. We can see how myths and generalizations that simplify Native Americans' understandings of trade and gift-giving obscure and hide how the economy actually functioned and worked. We can also see just how and why both groups culturally adapted to the economic practices and understandings of the other. Look for more information about Jessica, her book, The Lives and Objects, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/171. The Great Courses Plus can help you expand your investigation of history and help you satisfy your curiosity about other subjects that interest you, all with its vast library of over 8,500 on-demand video lectures. To experience the Great Courses Plus with a free trial, visit thegreatcoursesplus.com/bfworld. For less than $10 a meal, HelloFresh can help you create fresh, nutritionally balanced meals for you and your family all year round. All the recipes can be cooked in about 30 minutes, and all of the fresh ingredients you need to cook them will arrive in a well-insulated box right at your front door. To give HelloFresh a try and to save $30 off your first week, visit HelloFresh.com and use promo code BFWorld30. Today's episode had an assistant producer, Holly White. Thank you, Holly. Finally, Jessica mentioned that some people are sentimental about objects while others are not. What do you think? Are you sentimental about objects people have given you? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment in our listener community on Facebook. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.
Are you interested in the parts of history that remain a mystery? Do you want to learn more about the historical myths and misconceptions used to prop up false belief today? I'm Nathaniel Lloyd. In my podcast, Historical Blindness, I delve into all of these topics, sharing puzzling tales from the past and examining hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and misremembered events that provide insight into modern politics and religion. New episodes every 2 weeks. Find Historical Blindness on most podcast players and platforms.
As a longtime foreign correspondent, I've worked in lots of places, but nowhere as important to the world as China. I'm Jane Perlez, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. In our third season of Face Off, the US versus China, we'll explore some of the biggest issues dividing these global powers today. Trump and Xi Jinping, AI, China's growing military might, and also robots. New episodes of Face Off are available now, wherever you get your podcasts.